G'day, I'm Troy.
And I'm Brian.
And we're the hosts of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, an ex-evangelical podcast.
We used to be loyal members and leaders in Australian Christian megachurches, but we're not anymore.
I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is an honest and hilarious peek behind the curtain at the weird, the worrying, and sometimes traumatic world of evangelicals and Pentecostals.
We share our stories, we interview prominent guests in the global ex-evangelical space, and provide a platform for others to tell their stories about their time in evangelicalism and their journey out.
Shortlisted at the recent Australian Podcast Awards, I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist gives you a unique global perspective into one of the fastest growing religions in the world from the people who actually lived it.
You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and iwasateenagefundamentalist.com.
Hello listeners, I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, and I wanted to put a small announcement at the start of this episode. As with most of the content on this show, conversations do come with a trigger warning, so please proceed with caution. An article published by cosmopolitan.com by Catriona Harvey Jenner on October the 31st, 2016 stated this: a man who sexually assaulted young women between the ages of 12 and 24 after entering them into the cult he ran and leading them to believe he was a figure similar to Christ has been sentenced to 30 years in prison. 55-year-old Victor Bernard was given a reduced sentence as part of a plea bargain after he agreed to acknowledge his guilt in the court earlier this month. He ran the River Road Fellowship in Minneapolis, USA, in which he chose certain young women to live as part of his maidens group in a camp that was separate from their families. There it was discovered in 2012 when two women came forward and told police that Bernard had been sexually assaulting them since the ages of 12 and 13. The cult leader behaved inappropriately towards the women, scarring many of them emotionally for life. It was heard in court that the leader used religious coercion as a means to intimidate the young women into doing what he wanted to them, even telling one victim that he was, quote, a man of God. As reported by the Star Tribune, one of the victims publicly opened up about the 9-year ordeal which caused her a wealth of mental health problems, including post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. I used to see Victor as this powerful and monstrously strong man, she said. I am his downfall. He cannot break me. He is the one that is weak. He will be known all over the world as a sexual predator. Bernard was initially charged for a staggering 59 counts of sexual assault back in 2014, but he went on the run and wasn't imprisoned until last year when he was discovered in hiding in Brazil following an international manhunt. Prior to his sentencing, Victor Bernard said he was deeply sorrowful for what he'd done, adding, quote, God is good and his word is faithful and true. I have not walked in his goodness. Although the focus of River Road Fellowship has primarily been the man responsible for cultivating a following that allowed him access to vulnerable women and children, there is a lot to learn from the survivors of this group. Joining us today is Krista, who grew up within the River Road Fellowship and chats with me today to share her story and experiences with the rest of the world. In part 1, we discuss Krista's family history and how her loved ones became involved with Victor Bernard, with part 2 focusing on Krista's own experiences and escape from this cultic group. For early access to full-length ad-free episodes, please consider supporting the show at patreon.com/thecultvault. But for now, here is Krista. So hello, Krista, and welcome to the show. We have had this chat booked in for a while now, and I am so glad that we are finally able to connect after talking on social media for so long. Today, we're going to be hearing about something new on the show, and I am looking forward to this education today. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me, Casey. My name is Krista Lester Pitch. I am a mom and a wife, and I am a cult survivor, and I currently live in Bellingham, Washington. So that is who I am.
It's early January, so what's the weather like for you in Washington?
So right now it's rainy and cloudy. January is usually just a very wet month for us. The snow is usually gone by January. Sometimes we'll have snowstorms, but it's usually fairly warm, usually 50s, 60s, and just wet.
Washington and Washington, D.C. are two different places. And the
They are.
Washington that you're in, is that the one that's like beautiful views, very mountainous, less to do with
Yes.
government?
Yes. Yes. It's beautiful here. I have a beautiful view from my house of the water. We have views of the mountains just down the road. Like when I'm driving down my road, I can see the mountains in Canada. And yeah, it's a
Wow.
beautiful, beautiful place to live.
What sorts of wild animals do you have in that part of the world that we might not see in too many other places?
Oh gosh. Well, it's a pretty popular one. We have a lot of metropolitan deer that just live in the city, which is kind of strange. I always found that a bit funny. Um, there's mountain goats up in the mountains. That's not super common everywhere. We have we've had cougar and bobcat sightings even in neighborhoods, which is very bizarre. But they're not uncommon here. So the city basically just sort of built itself up around the wildlife, and they just kind of stayed, which I find to be pretty fascinating because you don't see that everywhere. So
I think our version of that is foxes. We get a lot of
yeah.
foxes that like to roam through our kind of more urban areas, and you can hear them screaming in the night. They sound terrifying. They sound like people being like injured.
Oh
It took
yeah,
me
yeah.
years to realize that's I think I was up one night and I wasn't very well, and I heard the noise and I was like, that sounds like it's right outside our house. There were two foxes like screaming at each other across the
Oh my
street, and
goodness.
I was just like, that is what that noise is. And then I would hear it night after night and be like, there's the foxes again. So not
Mm-hmm.
quite as maybe not quite as exciting as a cougar, but still quite interesting to see packs of, I
Yes.
don't I don't know if you'd call them packs, but packs of wolves together just going through the
Hmm.
town, just
Yeah.
r-
We don't
through the
see a lot
rubbish
of wolves
bins. And
out in the more rural area. There's a lot of coyotes, and I've seen a lot of coyotes running around in fields out there, which I lived out there for about a year, and it was kind of scary. I couldn't let my dog out by herself because there were stories and of coyotes getting small pets and stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of deer in the city. There's wildcats. I caught a raccoon on our outdoor camera a couple nights ago, just walking through our driveway. um, and then there's just other little animals like rabbits. There are a ton of rabbits all over the place, and especially in the springtime, they're everywhere. So yeah, it's
sounds like a pretty
we I mean
beautiful place to live.
it is a beautiful place to live. We live right adjacent, like backed up to a well, we call them green belts here, but it's basically a stand of trees that nobody's allowed to touch, and there's a trail through there. So even though we live in town, it is still very wooded and very beautiful.
And you mentioned that you've got little ones and you've got a dog and you've got a husband, so it's all very nice and nuclear by the sounds of things.
Yes, on a surface level, sure. I do have a husband and a son who is 8.5 months old, and then I have a dog who's been with me since before all of that. So um, yes, and then we also my mom lives with us as well, and she helps me take care of our son. So
It's
it's
it's important to have that help, because 8.5 months is a tiny, teeny, tiny little baby, and they are, yeah, it's a lot of work, isn't it?
Mhm.
And this is your first experience as well, so I was very surprised by how much of a shock it was to me, even though people said, "Oh, your life will change," and then you're like, "Yeah, I know," and then you're like, "Well, I didn't know, but now I
Yeah,
do."
yeah, yeah. It's definitely been he's such a fun kid. I've just had so much fun watching him grow, and he's such a happy child. I always thought parenthood would be very hard. I don't feel like it, like at this point at least, it's not. Like he's just
That's
a
lovely.
very, very fun child, which is, I feel like I'm very blessed. He's never been very upset or difficult to deal with. He's very, very easy. So
That's
yes, I
awesome.
feel
That's
incredible.
great. It's like almost like the setup for, you know, the perfect setup for more children almost, you know. It's kind of like, well,
Yes,
if
yes.
this one's like this, then I'll have 10 or 20 more. Oh, that's
Yes,
lovely.
but it's not lost on me that not every child is like that, and it's extremely false advertising on his part. Because I know people who have had babies who are extremely easy, and then they have another one, and it's a completely different experience. So I hope that my next child is easy, but I'm ready for anything, really.
Ready for the challenge, ready for,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
it's wonderful. They just, yeah, kids are just absolutely fascinating to watch them go
Hmm.
through all the different stages and really like grow into their own personalities and yeah, and
Yeah.
just really develop. It's quite a magical thing to watch, really.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
babies aside, what is the name of the group that we are going to be learning about today?
It is called, or was called, River Road Fellowship. And it was a cult that was primarily based in East Central Minnesota in a very, very, very small town called Finlayson.
Is Minnesota heavily affiliated with any particular church or religion, or is it a sort of mix of all different types of faith-based groups?
There are a lot of different faith-based groups there. I'd say in more recent years, there's been a lot more immigration that's happened, especially from places like Africa. Um, where I'm from, most of the population is either Catholic or Lutheran, mostly Lutheran. That's I would say that's probably the main religion in the state. At least it was. Things may have changed. I haven't lived there in, well, this will be my 14th year in Washington, so I haven't lived there in quite a while, and things can change. But there were a lot of Lutherans and a lot of Catholics when I was growing up.
Was River Road Fellowship also Lutheran?
No, we were non-denominational and very separate. Obviously, cults are always generally very separate. It was very fundamentalist, I would say.
Right. Okay. Is there a brief history that you can give us on the group, sort of how it
Mm-hmm.
started,
Yeah.
who founded the group, and how did it expand? All that great
Yeah.
overview information.
Yeah. So I have a little brief history here that I wrote up yesterday. So it was started um, it actually came out of another group called The Way International, which is worldwide, pretty popular, non-denominational cult. A lot of people have heard of it, and if you haven't, there's a lot online about it. Um, and so it was founded in, well, it was started by a man named Victor Bernard, the River Road Fellowship was, and he became affiliated with the Way International in 1979. There was a group within the Way that was focused on training leadership that was called the Way Corps, and Victor was a part of that. He went on an expedition with them. I want to say probably 1985, 1986. I don't know the exact year. The expedition was called LEAD, which is an acronym for something. I'm not sure what. But there was a lot of rock climbing, hiking, fitness things going on. And he later claimed that it was on that expedition that God told him that to shepherd his people. And then he later changed it to God told him to shepherd and to teach his people. He started so he moved to Minnesota. He got married, moved to Minnesota, started home Bible fellowships. That was a big thing in the way International was home Bible fellowships. And in 1989, he officially separated himself from the way. And the story that we were told was he and his wife opted to not go to this yearly gathering that was at headquarters that was called Rock of Ages. And instead, they took a camping trip with 3 other families. And that became known in our church as the separating. So after that, he kept doing home fellowships. He moved to a property further north with another family. And my family lived on that property for about 6 months when I was a baby. And it was during that time that we lived there that River Road Fellowship was founded. He got the 501c3 approval and basically formed a church. River Road was the name of the road he lived on. It had more significance to him, but I don't really know exactly what that was, but it was biblical. And then it was shortly after that, like 1994, 1995, that Victor said that God had told him to acquire an existing camp. And in 1996, a camp in East Central Minnesota was purchased, and it had previously been a resort. So if you can kind of picture a resort type setting. And then before that, it had actually been a church camp. So there was a chapel already on the grounds. There was a dining hall. There was houses, bunk houses, anything you really needed to sort of facilitate a church camp. So that was purchased in 1996. He and his family moved there along with 3 other families. And then people from the Twin Cities, which was where we lived in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, all the believers would come up for fellowships and to help around the property. And then in 1998, all of the leadership in the church was invited to move to the Shepherd's Camp, which was what it was called. And it was shortly after that that Victor called the entire church to the Shepherd's Camp and told us, and I remember it, I was very young, but I remember the meeting. And he told us that he could no longer continue traveling to lead us, and that if we wanted to continue fellowshipping with him, that he would need us to move closer. And so my family packed up our home and we moved closer. We lived in a couple rented houses. That was still 1998. We lived in a couple rented houses, and then we eventually moved into a house across the street from the Shepherd's Camp for about 8 or 9 months. And then we moved to another location. So at this point, because everybody was moving up to the area, there were 4 or 5 different locations that people lived on. And then we moved to another location where I spent the majority of the rest of my childhood. The Shepherd's Camp was sold in 2004, and then we just lived on the other properties. And then in 2009, 2010, River Road Fellowship was dissolved. Some of us moved to Bellingham, where I live now still. Some moved to Spokane. Some moved, which is also in Washington. Some moved to Pennsylvania, and then some stayed in Minnesota. And the church itself was dissolved. The beliefs remained for a long time, and I will definitely go into a little bit of that later. But that's kind of a basic history of the church and sort of a timeline of everything that happened.
That's a great chronology. You said it was, kind of an overview, but it felt quite in depth, really. And
Yeah,
were you able to pinpoint where your family became involved in the group's history as well?
Yeah, so my family, I was not born yet. They became involved in 1990. I believe it was 1989 that my dad met Victor. He wasn't a cult leader yet. He was just a man, trying to find his way in the world after he left the Way International and trying to teach the Bible. And so he ended up getting a job where my dad worked, and my dad was tasked to train him. And Victor tried very hard to witness to my dad. And it took my dad a while to be receptive. But ultimately, he invited them to a fellowship that was at a campground nearby. And they went. And they were sold. At that point, they liked what they heard. I was talking to my mom about all of it yesterday, just trying to get a little bit more detail from her point of view. And she told me that they had been a part of a 12-step program previously that was kind of in turmoil, and they were just sort of looking for a place to belong. But more importantly, they wanted to learn about God, and they wanted to learn about the God of the Bible. And when they met Victor and heard him preach, that was what they heard at the time. So after that, they became involved with the church that was forming, and that was what I was eventually born into.
Victor Bernard, was he trained or educated, or did he have any formal education that would
Yes and
make
no.
him qualified to preach or run his own fellowship?
Yeah. So yes and no. So like I said, he was a part of the Way International. He was a part of this group called the Way Corps, which was a training program to train up leadership, to oversee different groups and area fellowships within the Way. Within that, there was a lot of different programs. One of them was an unaccredited 2-year seminary.
Okay.
So he did attend that college and graduated. It was called the Way College of Emporia. But other than that, he had a lot of charisma, and he had a lot of drive, and he had found something, and he was that meant something to him, and he just was trying to run with it. So I think that was basically his qualification. But he never held like a leadership position in the Way. He was just that was basically the extent of his qualification, was the training he had received.
We, as far as we know from the information that you've given us,
Mhm.
the only reason that he separated from the Way International was because of this message from God that he had received in the woods.
There were a couple reasons, and it was always a little bit arbitrary growing up what those reasons exactly were. The man who founded the Way International, Dr. Victor Paul Wierwille, he died in 1985. And during that time, the Way was in a lot of turmoil. There was a bit of division between the clergy, and there was there were, from what I understand, some allegations of inappropriate behavior with women, affairs with married women, within the clergy. And so there was a bit of a separation, and I'm not entirely sure why he completely separated, but it had something to do with that.
As an offside comment, you might not know the
Mhm.
answer to this, and I'll probably take it out during the editing, but he didn't happen to be standing on some tall rock when he received this message.
Okay, so there is a picture of him on a tall rock with like like a sun ring around him. And that was kind of the picture that was given to us to associate with him having received this message. But the message itself was on a mountain. It was actually Mount El Capitan, which I believe is in New Mexico. And he was on a solo, like they all broke off into these solo camping trips, but they called them duos because it was you and God. And it was during that duo that he was said to have received this message. And I was actually in a meeting with him with a bunch of other young people. I would say maybe when I was 14 or 15 years old. And somebody actually asked him about what the experience was like. And I was kind of getting a kick out of this because he's like, well, God didn't actually speak to me. And basically, he's like, you know, when you get like a feeling inside of your body, he's like, it was more like a still small voice inside of my head. And I was like, I was very confused by that. I was like, because he had always made it sound like God had spoken to him audibly, and he had actually written it all out, like what God had said to him. And but then when he was recounting it in this meeting that I was in, it sounded more to me like it was something that he had more thought up in his own head. So that always, whenever I think about that, I just kind of get a kick out of it. And there were a lot of inconsistencies, obviously, like that growing up. And my brain is just the way that my brain operates, it's very quick to catch those things. So growing up, even though I was born into it, there was a lot of things that was just like, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not consistent with what happened over here. And I think that really helped me, and this kind of is going forward, but that helped me in my decision to leave when I was 23. So
Interesting. His story is very similar to that of Moses in the Bible,
yeah.
isn't it?
But yeah. Whenever we'd have like these historical slideshows and stuff, and that would like tell about the history of the Way International and how the River Road Fellowship came out of that, and like the whole story. It was told every year on New Year's Eve. That was kind of like our Christmas. We'd all get together at the shepherd's camp and we'd sit and we'd watch this historical slideshow, and the whole story was told. Because we didn't celebrate Christmas, we didn't celebrate any of the holidays, so that was kind of like our Christmas. And every time that they start talking about the message that he received from God, they would flash this picture on the screen of him standing on Mount El Capitan with this sun ring kind of around him, like the camera caught this ring of sunlight around him. And I always thought that was just very I thought it was interesting that that picture existed with the story. And like, I don't know, it was just one of those things that now, like I said, now that I look back on it, it's sort of laughable, honestly.
Yeah, right. So you're on a solo trip or a trip, you and God.
Yeah.
Yet there was somebody there to take this picture, but this picture wasn't taken when that
Yeah.
happened. So you've reenacted the event with a
Mhm.
photographer.
Yeah, or something. I don't
Yeah.
really know. I wasn't there. I don't really know the whole story, or what was true and what was not. But yeah, that was
Right.
definitely one of those things that was just like a little, it was just, yeah, kind of funny when I look back on it.
So we kind of know a little bit about Victor. What
Mhm.
did was he kind of like a solo preacher, or did he have a family? Was he like a sort of like an average height and build, or was he a big imposing man?
He was, I would say, about 6 feet tall. Very good looking man. I mean, if you see pictures of him, he was, I'd say classically handsome. Um, very charismatic. He did have a wife and children, and we can go more into that as we go on, because that's a whole story. But He, I, I've heard accounts of people being afraid of him. I never felt afraid of him. Just like in his presence. He was very close friends with my dad, so I saw him more in the beginning, as when I was younger, as more like an uncle figure. He wasn't somebody that I was afraid of. I knew that he was important and special, and that my dad especially loved him very, very much. But he was, I'd say, especially at the beginning, he was a very normal guy, that just wanted to have fellowship with like-minded people and teach the Bible.
I see what you mean
And
about the way that he looks. I don't
yeah,
think you
yeah,
would. I think sometimes you can look at individuals and there's a certain aesthetic that you might think reminds you of what other notable cult leaders have
hmm,
had in common: long hair,
yeah,
facial hair.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, I see what you mean. I don't think I would pass this person in the street and think that's an interesting looking
No,
individual.
he was the thing that was special about him was how he carried himself. He was very charismatic, and he was charismatic even in the way he carried himself. And the way that he walked into a room, even just in silence, commanded authority. Just the way that he presented, and it turned heads. And um I didn't see him out in public very, like, outside of the church very often, but when I did, it was like he definitely stood out. And the way, just the way that his personality and the way that he treated people, and just his, even just his body language, which I always thought was rather fascinating. Which is like the charisma, that's a classic sign of a cult leader from all of the research that I've done. So it tracks. But yeah, I'd, like I said, I've heard people having stories of being afraid of him. As in general, I didn't feel that way. I respected him, but I was not afraid of him.
You mentioned that your parents, mostly your father, they were very fond of Victor Bernard, and
Mm-hmm.
they were also in a 12-step recovery program
Yep.
in the time leading up to meeting Victor. So there's a saying that says that you're always in recovery. Do
Mm-hmm.
you feel like your parents were in a place where there was maybe a gap or a void, or they were searching for something that and it just happened to be that they met Victor at a time in their lives where they were more susceptible or vulnerable to somebody like Victor Bernard?
I definitely do. And I think I mean, both of my parents are very strong-willed people. They both have very strong opinions on things. Like my father's passed away, but that's how he was, and my mom is the same way. I think they did find, or he found them in a very vulnerable point in their lives. Um, but he also kind of wore them down. My dad would tell this story about how, like, he and Victor became friends. Victor was trying to invite him to one of his Bible fellowships. My dad didn't want to come, and then they'd invite my parents over to their house for dinner, and it would always be on a night that one of these fellowships was taking place, and he was just trying to, like, sort of manipulate him into coming, and my dad would always be like, no, 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 no. And then finally, um, after several of these occasions, Victor actually came to their house and invited them to a fellowship at a campground. They were doing like a church camping trip, and there was a fellowship at a campground. And my dad was, sort of considering it. My mom, the story goes that my mom was kind of standing there in with her arms crossed, and she said, "I love God, but I hate organized religion." And Victor said to my mom, he said, "Laura, if you love God, you'll love this." And that was kind of the clincher for her.
How can
And
you argue with that? You can't
yeah, how
argue
could
with
you
that. You're like,
argue with that?
well, I do love God. I do love God, but I've
Yeah.
just said that I do love God.
Yeah. So they went and they were they were sold. It was what they believed they were looking for. So yeah, that was the what happened essentially.
I am thinking of a conversation that I had with Dr. Shaham Das, who is a forensic psychiatrist, and we spoke about 5 different types of narcissists.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the examples that Shaham gave, and I can't remember which one of the 5 categories this fell into, was the type of narcissist that will grind you down until you say yes. And then as soon as you say yes, that's when a fostering of dependency starts. So actually, even though it was you who said no, 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 yes, eventually the leader starts saying no to you, and you're like, but please, because I can't, I don't know how to do life without you. And isn't that such a twisted thing to really untangle and understand, how you go from
Oh
being the
yeah.
person that says no to being the person that says I need you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that definitely tracks when I think about my parents' experience. I would say for quite some time before and after my parents joined the church, my dad and Victor were very, very close. But then not too long later, my dad just kind of became another one of the sheep. And um my dad was always very in a very unique position in the church. He was kind of the fixer of certain problems, and he kept a lot of secrets for people. He ran a lot of errands that he never could talk about, and like a lot of different. So had a very unique position in the church, but he never held like a place of, regardless of how special Victor said he was to him. My dad never held a place of like high leadership. Was never recognized or honored in any way. My dad ran parking for church services. Like that was his job in like within the church. And so it definitely tracks with that type of narcissism. But my dad loved Victor, and he would have done anything for him during that time.
That's a scary thought, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you've mentioned that this is an offshoot of the Way International, which
Mm-hmm.
has tons of its own abuse allegations and scandals
Yeah.
tied to its name.
Mm-hmm.
And you've also mentioned that this was not based on Lutheran teachings, but more geared towards fundamentalism. So would you
Mm-hmm.
say that River Road Fellowship was a combination of the Way International's teachings and fundamentalism, or was it something that Victor really put together in his own?
It started off, I would say that a lot of what we believed was very parallel to the Way International. Um, Victor started, so there was a teaching series within the Way called Power for Abundant Living. Victor, after he left the Way, he continued to run those classes in his home. But eventually, I'm thinking it was due to legal issues and stuff, him not being a part of the Way, he stopped, and he ended up teaching his own version called Search the Scriptures. And so that was basically the foundation of the doctrine for our church. Again, it was very, very, very similar to the Way. I would say that the biggest separation, the biggest initial separation between the Way and what Victor taught, was that he believed that the church was the bride of Christ. The Way International did not believe that. The Way International believed that the children of Israel were the bride of Christ, and the church, the Gentiles, were the body of Christ. I don't know how all that works, but that was the big shift in doctrine. It continued to change throughout time, more and more teachings. He'd say God revealed this, like God revealed the bride to him, and God revealed this to him and that to him. And I can get into more of that in detail later on, but the foundation of what we believed was very, very, very similar to the Way.
Okay. And I've just been looking up some more information on the Way International, and its earliest years were it had a name before it became known as the Way International, and it was actually a radio broadcast ministry,
The
which
Vesper
is so
chime.
interesting.
Yeah.
That's it, the Vesper chimes. And that's so interesting because my conversation yesterday was with a woman called Rachel, who was brought up with Harold Camping's teachings, and Harold Camping was a radio broadcaster. So I always say these conversations, they just always all, they all cross over and link together. So
Yeah.
we're talking about the age of evangelist radio broadcasting, not televangelism. That came a little bit later, but it's made significant impact in terms of the different Christian groups that exist today. The one we're
Absolutely.
talking about wouldn't have existed if that Vesper Chimes radio broadcast ministry didn't exist in the first place. So just a little interesting aside there for anybody that's interested in the kind of theological progression of things, which is something that I do find really interesting in connecting all these things together. So you think that Victor really based his teachings on a combination of what he did agree with in the Way, and then the things he wanted to change, or the things that he believed were incorrect, and he knew the correct versions of those things, he then implemented into
precisely. And he was the only one who knew these things. There were lots of other Way Core graduates that had started following him, people who were even had been in the Way much longer than him, but they somehow were not qualified to have any of this knowledge. Only he was. And if they had any questions, or had any felt like they had received any like revelation from God, they would always have to run it by him to make sure that it was correct. So I always found that a bit odd too.
And if we're speaking about fundamentalist influences, was there a certain misogynistic aspect to the way that the fellowship was conducted?
For a long time, misogynistic. The let the women keep silence in the church was a big thing. That was, I would say, for the majority of the time River Road Fellowship was functioning, women were not allowed to preach, teach. We were allowed to speak in the church, like as a maybe a supplement to teaching, or something along those lines, but we were not allowed to teach the Bible. And there were certain women that he did lean on as advisors, but they were few and far between. I would say maybe only one or two. Most of the people that he collaborated with or talked to, they were men. And women, there was never a woman. Well, that's not true. Later on, there was two women that were ordained but that was after River Road Fellowship was dissolved. So during the time that River Road Fellowship was in functioning, there were no women that were ever ordained or held any type of top leadership position.
The reason I asked that question is because I think that with some fundamentalist Christian teachings, there is often an environment that is created where the women are seen as less than. And I think it is in those environments where certain things can start taking place and go and go under the radar, which is prevalent to the discussion that we're going to be having in terms of why the fellowship dissolved in the first place.
Mhm.
And if anybody decides to go and look at River Road Fellowship before they listen to, the second part of our interview, they're
Mhm.
probably going to come across like all the information that you can find on Rick
Oh yeah.
Arabossa's website,
Oh
and
yeah.
that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
once you had began attending River Road Fellowship, going to the actual site, and then you moved over and lived locally so that you could attend
Mhm.
as a family the
Mhm.
services that Victor Bernard was putting on for people. What
Mhm.
would you say at that point? So was it 98 at that point, 1998?
98, 99, somewhere in there.
So
Mhm.
what would you say as a child, your typical week with River Road Fellowship, what did it look like in that period of time?
So, um, moving across the street from the camp, we were very much a part of what was happening at the Shepherd's Camp. So during that time, there were animals that lived on the property: cows, pigs, chickens, and sheep. And the women took care of the sheep, the men took care of all of the other animals. Um, so my typical day would be mind you, I lived there during the school year and we were all homeschooled. So my typical day would be getting up early in the morning, um, and going out to help tend to the sheep. We would come home, we'd do our school work, and we only my whole childhood growing up, we only did coursework for half days. So it's usually like 8:30 to 12:30 every day. And then in the afternoons, we would do sometimes we'd be at home, sometimes we would have some sort of organized fellowship or function happening across the street. And then 4 o'clock would come around, and that was our second, we called it animal care. And but it was basically, barn chores. And we went out and took care of the sheep again, and then came home, had dinner. Sometimes there were night fellowships when I was little. I did not attend those. We were just put to bed and our parents would attend to them. But then, when I got older, obviously we were expected to, if we could stay up later. And yeah, so that was a typical day. And it was similar
It's
once we
pretty
moved
busy.
too.
It's a pretty busy day, and it's very much
Mm-hmm.
centered around the activities of the fellowship.
Oh yes, and it was very similar once we moved too. Like the flavor didn't change much from location to location.
You mentioned that your mum was um religious. She loved God. She had her own relationship with her faith, but did
Mm-hmm.
not have time for organized religion. At this point, this is very much organized religion, isn't it? You've just
Mm-hmm.
talked about a pretty regimented timetable
Yep.
that yourselves and the adults were expected to adhere to. So
Mm-hmm.
at this point, are your parents fully committed, both your mum and dad?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of backstory behind why my mom fully believed for the majority of my childhood that the only reason that she got pregnant with me was because Victor prayed over her, and that she basically owed him my life. She'd been having trouble conceiving, and she asked to be prayed over at this meeting that, I don't remember exactly what the meeting was about, but and he asked her what about. She said she wanted to have a baby, and then she got pregnant with me. So she always believed that I was like the result of that. My dad had some serious health issues. I mean, first off, my dad was the kind of person who was a very, very loyal friend. He, once he was your friend, you couldn't get rid of him, and that's just who he was. And so he had become friends with this man, and he was going to see it through. And but then he had some very severe health issues, and was actually very severe physical health issues and mental health issues. And the story that I was told is Victor essentially saved his life and basically brought him back to reality and helped him get the help he needed. So they felt very strongly that they owed their lives and my life to Victor. And they were going to follow him wherever he went.
I think that's confirmation bias, looking for a sign that this is the right thing to do, having issues conceiving or trouble conceiving, and then putting the actual pregnancy down to the act of one man praying over you. I imagine, well, we've heard people say on the show how powerful that can be when they've had those experiences. And your father's health on top of that is, it's just another added layer. And I think that we've talked before about how narcissists can recognize those traits of dedication and loyalty in people, and they will seek them out. So again, it makes sense that he pursued your father until your father was like, okay, then I'll come and see what it's all about. If he recognized those traits of loyalty, he probably had his eyes on your father for a time leading up to where he decided to really pursue him. And I think it's a really uncomfortable thing to think about, isn't it? Like your parents being targeted to be exploited, like targeted for the purposes of exploitation. That's a really and this might not have been what it was like at all. I am just speculating from things that we've heard from previous conversations and things that experts have said. It's important to point those things out in case we ever find ourselves in situations where we are repeatedly saying no, 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 no.
Yeah.
To whatever, whether that's consent around sexual intercourse, or whether you're going to join, a local Bible study.
I think I try to not speculate a whole lot, but I've done a lot of study about narcissism over the past several years, just because it's an interest of mine, but also to try and make sense of a lot of the stuff that I experience. And I've heard accounts of the early days of the church and more what it was like. And Victor was absolutely a narcissist. He absolutely wanted control, but I honestly don't know that that's what he knew that was what he wanted. I think that in his mind, he genuinely wanted people to fellowship with and to rebuild something that he had lost. And when I hear accounts from people who had come into his ministry, that is what they have said. Like, it was just fellowship around the Bible. He was just trying to teach the Bible. His heart was to just, have a fellowship of people who were like-minded. And I genuinely believe that he believed that's what he wanted, but the way that his mind operated and the way that he went about it was not necessarily the best, and it just became more and more and more convoluted and sinister as time went on, and his true intentions and his true colors began to come out more and more.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series on the River Road Fellowship. For early access to ad-free full-length episodes, please visit patreon.com/thecultvault. To contact me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.